Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be going over the finals match of the Golden Toaster Longsword Open, which happened in Philly a couple weeks ago between John Paulino and Michael Asbury. And I wanted to go over this fight despite the fact that these are two people who I believe have been featured on the channel before and probably in a finals match before, but particularly because of, one, this was a very interesting fight that was very close between two people who really knew each other's styles and had a lot of interesting adaptations to try to overcome each other, but also because this particular tournament had another really interesting rule set that I think came up in a lot of key exchanges that might have determined the outcome. So it's another great place to have a conversation about whether or not we like or don't like certain tournament rule sets, and we can see firsthand the kinds of exchanges that they really make an impact on. Now, that having been said, I'm not going to talk about the rule set yet until I get to those exchanges, because I feel like if you're watching this fight normally and you're already thinking about the rule set, you're going to look at certain exchanges differently. So we're going to go through a bunch of exchanges. They're going to turn out to be pretty much normal most of the time. And then when we get to the ones where it really matters, that's when I'll bring up the rules. So for our first exchange, we have a pretty classic setup on the side of John. If you've ever fenced John before, you know that this is the thing that he loves to do most of all, and there's a really good reason for it. And the reason is that he sets up almost all of his offensive actions from this exact same starting point. As you can see from watching the exchange, he comes forward while threatening a thrust from a left plow kind of position, at which point he gestures up, goes into a cron, and from that position, he can do one of two or three things. One, he can throw his Verkow onto the same side, or he can throw his Verkow onto the opposite side. And knowing which side that Verkow is coming from already puts his opponent in a position where they more or less have to guess. However, there's another little aspect to this, and that is something you can't quite see thanks to the camera angle, but something that you can sort of see once they start to, continue the forward momentum and separate a little bit. And that is, John has the ability to turn that Verkow from a horizontal cut to a plunging vertical cut at the exact same time as he is couching one or the other. And that's important to consider here, because if you watch this exchange, what you see is Michael, who's on the right here, sees the gesture upwards from John on the left and decides to throw a kind of Shield-How plunging vertical cut of his own on his left side. And what this results in is both John and Michael throwing the more or less the exact same kind of cut vertically down onto each other's head, but on opposite sides, each of their left sides, resulting in a double. It's not a very interesting outcome as far as points go, but it does point to the kind of feedback loops that we're going to be dealing with throughout this fight, because Michael is going to have to be responding to this kind of setup if he wants to dominate John in that mid-range. At the exact same time, John is going to have to pull out some more interesting options from this starting point if he's going to get around the adaptations of Michael. For our next exchange, we have two real adaptations going on here. The first happens about halfway through the exchange, where John gestures forward that he's going to thrust, and Michael does a little bit of an overreaction, but a reaction that is actually very much appropriate to what he thought was coming. What he does is he jumps in the air a little bit and throws a very horizontal cut along the high line in an attempt to set aside the thrust that he thought was coming at his head. This would have been a really, really smart response because A, it would have raised his shoulder line, which meant that when he threw that horizontal cut, he would have been significantly more likely to engage John's thrust on the weak of his blade, which would have been very helpful for setting it aside. At the exact same time, that horizontal cut across the middle meant that if John had stepped forward into range, he would have most certainly either been hit on the side of the head or the arms with that horizontal cut, or if he had been a little bit out of range, Michael would have been able to reassert his point since he had just been able to push John's sword off to the side. However, that's not what happened. Instead, the thrust to the center line was just a feint from John, and Michael looks to jump and, again, overreact a little bit. Now, knowing what Michael is planning on doing, John decides that he is going to step into range and try to get that exact same reaction again. He inches closer and closer, banking on the idea that Michael is going to respond very similarly to how he just responded, and that's not a bad idea to have. And in a way, Michael does respond very similarly. What happens is after they enter this range, John pauses for a second in order to let Michael do his response, and Michael does the exact same response, only without a jump. He stands basically exactly where he is and throws a very high line, almost Zverkow or middle house style horizontal cut straight across the middle at the line of the shoulder. And what this means is that the left plow stance that John was in is no longer really able to push off or set aside this attack very effectively. At the exact same time, John, who was waiting for probably some kind of jumping attack that wasn't properly in range, throws his hands up a little bit and comes straight down on top of the head of Michael. And what this really shows you is that both of them are trying to get into each other's loops, and they're trying to figure out a way in which they can dictate what the other person is going to do, either offensively or defensively. But so far, they've both been going so far down their feedback loops that neither of them has done anything predictable, and they both resulted in more or less a double. For our next exchange, we see our first successful point gathered, or at least in my opinion, the first real successful exchange where there is no real open double, and one in which we coincidentally see the first real adaptation on the part of John. Now, John has been setting up this entire time his very classic loop where he gestures forward with a thrust, gauges your reaction, goes up into a cron, and then throws, one of a couple of options. Only this time, he throws the thrust, but he doesn't just throw it from cold open. He throws it with a little bit of a wind and a little bit of a dip. Normally in German longside we call this Durchwechsel. I don't like saying that word because it's very confusing. And in Italian it's Contravasione, which is even longer and even more confusing. But the basic principle here is that when you're throwing a thrust, what someone has to do in order to set you off to the side is give you horizontal momentum. They have to take your blade and they have to push it either to one side or the other. Because if they go straight up, chances are they're just going to take it from going into your neck, into your face. And it's not generally the best idea. Plus, when someone throws a flat thrust at you, pushing up usually goes against the curve of the blade and results in situations where, despite the fact that you've gotten your guard up high enough, there's still a point planted in your chest. So the idea here is that by doing this little dip that John does right as he's coming forward with his thrust, he does a really great job of ducking under whatever sort of windshield wiper-esque parry is likely trying to come in to set his thrust off to the side. However, every single time you do a little bit of a dip with your point, you have a really hard time getting it back into presentation with your point control. John does a really good job of getting it back online, but it's unclear from the camera angle here whether or not this initial thrust actually lands. However, that doesn't really matter, because what does matter is after it does or does not land, John continues and utilizes a principle called overrunning, in which case he continues his forward momentum to go past his opponent and throws a nice right Zverkow in the meantime that is meant to cut directly into the line of anyone else's defense, basically where their head or their hands are going to be. So, as a result of this, Michael has attempted to set a thrust off to the side. He is or is not successful in doing so, and now he has a choice. He can either try to defend against the right Zverkow that he basically knows is coming, but is unable to do so because of how jammed up against his arms it is. At the exact same time, he throws his own right Zverkow, but because of the situation he was in prior to trying to throw this right Zverkow, he has a significantly shorter range of motion that he can utilize in order to bring it to bear. Which means that, at least in my opinion, when you watch this in slow motion, Michael Asbury's right Zverkow here basically goes from just being pointed straight up to straight to the side, which doesn't really have a lot of range of motion or rotation, and thus doesn't really have a lot of power. More importantly, though, it's also very, very difficult to not throw those strikes flat, and as a result, his edge is not quite in ideal alignment. At the exact same time, John, who had this set up from the beginning, has a very easy time of getting his edge on alignment and manages to get a really nice Zverkow straight into the hands of his opponent. Now, I'm going to skip a few exchanges here because this exchange that I'm going to show here is the next part where I see another real adaptation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things you have to deal with whenever you're fighting John is you have to deal with his offensive gamesmanship. And one of the best ways to deal with anyone's offensive game is to make sure that they can never get going. So the adaptation I see here from Michael is that he is continually throwing out these peppering little hand shots. And the reason he's doing that is because he wants to make 100% sure that if John ever wants to go from his plow to his, cron style position where he throws a lot of his offensive options, he's going to have to deal with the fact that he might get hit in the hands first. And this is coincidentally also one of the first times we get to talk about the rules of this. Now, as is usual, most of the time an afterblow or is not considered valid based on whether or not it occurs within a certain tempo. And tempo is usually defined by an intention. The idea here being that if you are trying to do something with your weapon, it is either an attack or it is not. And if it is not an attack, then it is considered not in tempo. If someone attacks you, then you have to do something to stop them, and then you have to do something to try to hit them back. The idea here being that if you have a one tempo afterblow rule set, which this system does, the idea is that anytime you are doing something other than attacking, you are vulnerable to be getting hit, and if you then hit them after you are hit during your intermediary phase, it is going to still count for them. And the idea, and the reason this is important, is because these little peppering hand shots, if they were to hit John while he went up into his cron, would count not only as a valid hit, but it would also invalidate anything John did afterwards as an attack. So for an example, if during one of these little hand shots, Michael hit John in the hands as he went up, and then John threw his patented Zverkow on the right side and hit Michael in the head, it would not count because it would be out of tempo. And this is a very, very key engagement here, because what this means is that Michael has effectively shut off one of John's best offensive options. By throwing these peppering hand shots out there constantly, he basically forces John onto the back foot and forces him to constantly retreat every time Michael comes forward, because he's afraid of doing the one thing that he loves to do most. So, as a result, when this exchange does finally resolve, we see Michael come forward with a nice shot to the head at the exact same time as John, who is desperately trying not to get hit in the hands, goes up for the parry and then hesitates a moment and then goes for a hand shot of his own. Now, based on the camera angle, I can't see whether or not this is a double because, of course, if you don't really go for the parry, you're not out of tempo. But the more important aspect here is that we have seen a complete shift in who is initiating the action in these exchanges. So for this next exchange, Michael is going to start taking control of the fight via his offensive actions. And the first offensive action he throws is a very strong ballistic thrust from committed cold open. Now, the idea here is that a lot of people would consider this very risky. And it is, in a lot of ways, because when you have to commit to a thrust like this one and you get parried, you're often left in a very, very vulnerable position. However, Michael has shown in the previous exchange that he is taking control of the fight by throwing these kinds of feinted hand shots at John in order to get him on the defensive. And once you have your opponent on the defensive, throwing committed offensive attacks like this is often a really good idea. So what we see in this exchange is Michael comes in with that thrust. He does manage to land it. And in part, the reason he manages to land it is because he inverts his sword when he throws that thrust. What inverting your sword means in this case is it means he has his hands higher than his tip. And the reason this helps is that when you thrust downwards with that little bit of angle, it helps make sure that whatever horizontal parry your opponent is trying to throw to get your thrust offline probably has to engage more with the middle of your sword rather than the weak, which means that you have a little bit more leeway in how much effort you can throw forward and how much they have to throw to the side in order to get you out of the way. As a result, when John throws this Zverkow that he uses to try to simultaneously parry and attack Michael Asbury's thrust, he doesn't quite have enough oomph on it, and because his hands can't quite get to the height that they need to, he is unable to set the thrust off to the side and ends up getting hit in the initiating action. Now, this is another instance where rules are going to come into play, because previously, in a Philadelphia rule set, there was something called attack priority. Attack priority, which is now gone from this rule set. So normally, in attack priority, the person who initiates the action gets priority, and if both people hit at the exact same time with their initial actions, the person who truly initiated will get the point and the other person will get nothing. Essentially saying that you used your first tempo to attack and the other person used their first tempo to stand still. This is not what's happening here, and as a result, this exchange is a double. And I think that's really important to point out here, because there are certain ideas that people have about suicidal fencing, where they would say, oh, well, Michael came in with a really committed thrust, but he couldn't defend himself, so he got hit, so it's a double, so he shouldn't get any points. At the exact same time, though, there's also an argument to be made that John, who saw Michael Asbury coming forward with a really offensive thrusting action, decided to throw an attack rather than a hard parry, and as a result got hit by the thrust, meaning that it was his decision to make, sort of, to suicidally, quote unquote, throw that Zverkow in rather than a parry. The result here is that in my opinion, we came out with an interesting exchange that didn't really have an interesting outcome in terms of points, but one in which we can still say is going to the advantage of Michael, maybe not in the points department, but in the fact that he's taking control of the fight overall. Now, for this next exchange, we see another really interesting adaptation from Michael Asbury, but one in which we can either say was some real serious high IQ 4D chess, or just a little bit of an instinctual assumption. And the reason we have to talk about this is because one thing I've talked about before is that oftentimes people will try to get into each other's heads and try to move certain steps down each other's feedback loops in order to come out on top. But as a result, sometimes the counter to somebody who's constantly trying to outthink you is to just do the most basic thing imaginable. Now, for this particular exchange, we see this setup to be similar as the ones before, where Michael is taking control of the fight by threatening towards the hands constantly while moving forward in order to keep John on the defensive. However, in my assumption, the things probably going through Michael's mind right now are, John knows that I'm going to constantly threaten with the hand shots, and one of the best counter to someone threatening hand shots but not actually coming forward is just throw that big thrust straight down the middle. I believe that's what Michael was thinking, because when John takes a step forward, he doesn't really throw any threatening action, but Michael does the exact same response that he had pre-programmed earlier for when John was going to throw that big thrust. He jumps up into the air and throws a horizontal cut across the middle. Now, ironically, John did not throw the thrust here, but because he didn't throw the thrust, he actually got a little bit too close, and Michael was able to still capitalize on the fact that John was threatening the thrust to throw this jumping middle hell thing, and then land with the point directly into John's face while John was doing nothing. So in a way, the threatening hand shots were going to be countered by a thrust, so Michael tried to do the counter to the counter to the counter, only to find that he inadvertently countered the most basic option that John could have thrown, which was just step forward in a measure and see what was going on. The irony here being that the reason this works out the way that it does is because Michael is still in John's head as far as the offensive actions go. If John had simply thrown some kind of offensive action off of this, he probably would have at least doubled or maybe even landed his thrust to begin with, because I think Michael wasn't really as ready for this thrust as he maybe looks like he was when he, did the pre-programmed response. But after a result, the idea here is that Michael is getting some clean, clear points that are slowly bringing up the lead to a more even exchange. And as we get towards the end of this fight, we're going to see some more adaptations that really show that taking control of the fight at this point was one of the reasons why Michael ended up winning. Now, next up, we have an exchange that, at least in my opinion, kind of proves me right in some of the ramblings that I've been going on previously. If you thought that I've been talking out my ass a little bit about the other exchanges here, well, this sort of proves that I'm right. And it proves I'm right because what we see here is John throw the thrust from open and immediately counter the tiny little hand snipes that Michael has been threatening him with. And the reason this is such an intelligent decision is because A, it takes back the initiating action for John, which he is obviously much more comfortable with, and it was how he was winning the fight to begin with. And two, it shows that Michael's hand shots aren't nearly as threatening as he would like you to think that they are. The problem here is that the reason that the hand shots were threatening before was because they were threatening to John's intermediary cron position from which he throws either Zverkows or plunging cuts. So as long as John cuts out that cron position, there's really no reason to be afraid of the hand shots at all. And the obvious setup that you can do without going to that cron position is just throw that thrust. Now that John has finally realized that that's what he's needed to do, he throws it, he lands it, and very importantly, we see that Michael does not have the appropriate answer that he thinks he does to this thrust. Normally, he had seemingly tried to respond to this by jumping to the air and throwing a horizontal cut, but in my opinion, this would not have saved him from this particular kind of thrust, and more importantly, the response that he does throw is a kind of Scheitelhau over the top to the top of the head that he can't quite land because John does a really good job of putting his lunge deep and low and his hands high and towards his target. The reason this is important is because when you land a thrust to somebody else's chest or head or neck, one of the ways that you need to keep yourself safe is to use the horizontal position of your crossguard to act as a shield from anything that comes above. So if someone is going to try to throw something to the top of your head, you need to make sure that your head is below your crossguard, something that you need to do by both putting your hands pretty high in the air and, most importantly, by lunging deep into your legs. This way, you lower your head by going low into your lunge and raise your hands, which ensures that they stay above your head. All in all, a really perfect execution of a thrust, but another indication that John might be taking this fight back. So I'm going to bundle these final two exchanges together, and I'm going to do that not only because I believe there is the same adaptation going on in both of these exchanges, but because it also brings up the exact same discussion of rule set. Now, one thing we talked about earlier is the lack of attack priority rule set here. And attack priority rule set is something that a lot of people don't like. However, if we were to watch these last two exchanges with an understanding of attack priority, John would have gotten both points. The reason, of course, is that he is the one who initiates both actions, and even if you consider the final one to be a proper parry riposte, in my opinion, it is one in which it would have been extremely risky to do so, regardless of whether or not it succeeded. The idea here is that attack priority is supposed to give credence to the person who is initiating the action, and as we saw throughout this fight, whenever John is the initiator of the action, he tends to land his attacks, meaning that attack priority would have been extremely helpful for him here. But, of course, this rule set did not have attack priority, and what that means is that Michael has the advantage here in that now that John has to take control of the offensive action or to get the kind of success that he had earlier on, Michael knows that he can go for these kinds of counterattack, counter-parry riposts while standing his ground without real fear of losing too many points. The reason for that is that if you go for a parry and you fail a parry, you're going to be out of tempo for your response cut. But if you do a counterattack that tries to zone out your opponent's incoming attack, you have actually a 50-50 chance of landing it or parrying it. And what that means is that if you do parry it, well, you can throw a follow-up attack. And if you do land it, it's a double and nothing happens. This is the reality of what some people would consider suicidal fencing, because the reality is that even though attacking and knowing that you're safe can result in something that a lot of people would call suicidal, there's also a version here where throwing something defensive counterattacky and knowing that you don't actually have to worry about whether or not your opponent lands against you is similarly a kind of suicidal action. This is an action that Michael is taking here that is adapted to the rule set and, most importantly, to the kinds of actions he knows John is going to take, and as a result, he gets the win. But the idea here is that Michael could have easily had to adapt completely differently to a now offensively minded John if offensive attacks were given priority. So it's something to think about. If you're the kind of person who hates attack priority rule sets because you think it creates suicidal fencing, well, sorry, but that's not the only way something like that can happen. But if you're the kind of person who likes attack priority rule sets and you want to see more stuff like that because you believe it creates a defensive intention for your opponent, remember that you're also kind of throwing out the ability for people to throw attacks in opposition and know full on that they're going to get a result. So at the end of the day, neither one is going to give you the kind of fencing that you probably ideally want. So maybe if you're the kind of person who thinks that these rule sets completely change the way people fence overall, you're kind of right, but you're also kind of wrong. I would say that the reason Michael had the best and last adaptation here is not only because he adapted to the rule set, but because he adapted to what he knew John was going to come at him with. And as a result, he was able to get the clean, well, at least so-called by the judges, clean parry riposte on the final action that won him the overall match and won him the gold medal. But if you want to see more reviews like this, I'm going to be doing another one on Thursday. Hopefully this is a bit of a return to form for me where I have an extremely long, in-depth description of things. So I'll hopefully have another one on Thursday, and I will see you then.